thank you guys for being here. As you know, I'm NJSSC's co-chair, but I really got my start in NJSSC working as the Green Amendment Coordinator. So I have about two little more years in campaign experience. Margaret and I started that campaign, and we have been working really hard over the past few years, planning it and recruiting for it and organizing it. So if you have any questions beyond what is covered in this presentation, which is really just about the proposal stage and getting started, always feel free to ask me or ask Margaret for that matter. Also, aside from my own experience, a lot of this presentation also comes from what was created by Joanna, our alumni advisor, and April Nicolaus, who founded NJSSC at first. She got a lot of her experience and created the original versions of these trainings that we've adjusted and edited a little bit to get you this updated version from PIRG, where she worked for many years in college. So always giving that credit where credit is due. The key takeaways from this training, again, we are focusing on a campaign proposal, which is just an actual document that's usually some sort of written format. You can play around with what works best for you. That is semi-formal. Oh, new person. Great, we have several people here. Going to keep going. So basically the key takeaways for this training are going to be the structure of this campaign proposal documents. And then we're going to talk a little bit about power and how to plan strategy, keeping that in mind, which will help you when you create the content that goes into that structure. And then talk a little bit about reviewing that proposal. And then of course, questions and stuff like that. And not super interactive because again, little crunch for time. And I need to probably drop off at 6. But first, why do we develop campaign proposals before we go into the nitty gritty of the structure? Well, again, a campaign proposal is a written document, semi-formal, meaning that it's usually private to some degree. You're writing it for yourself as the primary audience. You may share it with possible partners or with me or Joanna or Joyce, or with the people that you're indieing with to talk about your plans. Or maybe with other team members, but really this is not a public document. This is a way for you to plan out how you are going to run your own campaign. So you can play around with how exactly you want to format it and what content that we're going to talk about makes the most sense to emphasize for your own campaign. We use them because even though we're not sharing them, it's really important to have one to win real change. This means legislative change, educational change, stronger community or leadership development, whatever type of change that you're doing, because you can do an endless amount of work organizing without making any of these changes if you're not organized from the start and you don't know what your end goal is and what your strategies are and have a coordinated campaign, right? So this plan is really essential to making sure that all your efforts are worth it. It's kind of along that same vein, important to directing action effectively. You can do a lot of work and you can work really hard, but you can also produce minimal results. Planning is a great way to streamline your project and make sure that no effort is being wasted. And then finally, it's really useful to recruiting and motivating volunteers, right? People want to come into projects that they know have direction, where they can easily slot themselves into a role where they know exactly what they're doing right away, or where they can ask you, hey, what am I doing? Or what are you guys doing that I can help with? So it's important to recruitment to, even if you're not showing them the campaign proposal, to have this in your mind to create an organized project and motivate people because they feel like, oh, this is more of an official campaign now that you have a plan. The first part of your campaign proposal is going to be a little section on the problem. So what is the problem you're working to solve? Think of it as the introduction to this type of paper or plan that you're writing. This problem that you talk about needs to be specific. It needs to be realistic. So something that you're actually capable of contributing to a solution. This may mean having layers of problems, like climate change may be your big problem, but obviously your single campaign can't solve global climate change, right? Within the context of climate change, you may specifically want to solve the problem that there is a lack of education about climate change among policymakers on the local level. So you may want to go around educating people in like town councils and other types of local governments, and that is a problem that's realistic for you to contribute to a solution to. Then you want to talk about why is this a problem, specifically focusing on the context for you as an individual and for the people that you're going to be talking to. Again, aim for something that is specific and realistic. Realistic in that you think that the average person who doesn't necessarily share your particularly priorities or your passions about the environment will agree it's a problem and will care about it, even if their main priorities are a little bit different. The best way to approach this question is by thinking about local issues that your problem is creating, leading to the next question, which is how does this affect people in your local community? Because this generally unites people who have different like life priorities around a single issue, right? Because we all share the same community. This can make your campaign proposal a little bit more personal. If your campaign is addressing all of New Jersey, maybe address effects across the state first, and then narrow down to a specific community and yourself so you understand your own motivations. If you don't understand your own motivations, it's going to be a lot harder to run your campaign really well. Passion about the issue is really important in a leader, and people are going to ask you a lot, or you'll just have to explain in your pitches, whether you're lobbying or recruiting or giving a presentation, what your motivation is. So it's good to have kind of read it out here first and then have a go-to spiel about why you care about this issue and why it's important to you. And then think about what do people in your community think about this problem. They may or they may not agree with you already. And so what they think can maybe be a part of the problem if they don't have education about the issue or they disagree with you. Or it could be a part of the solution if you know that, oh, I have this base of people in my community that are willing to work with me. And that kind of leads you into the next part, which is your solution. So again, we kind of like to work with big picture and then we narrow it down from there. So first thinking about how do we solve the problem as a society, or we're thinking about different layers of the problem. Write your campaign plan out a little bit like your thought process is going to be, because that's really what this is, a written thought process, forcing you to think it through. Laying out the bigger picture is a great way to narrow it down to the important part, which is the specific slice of the problem that you can tackle. Remember, specific and realistic. And you also need to think about what is the best or the most compelling piece for you specifically to tackle. Ideally, this is something that's both going to motivate others and relates to your own motivation to the issue. So particularly something where youth or students may have a lot of power or a lot of authority on that subject already, right? And something that you personally care about as well. Then think about where you or your group can make the biggest impact. This is probably the most important piece of narrowing down the problem to your specific campaign. The most compelling piece may require taking actions that are impossible for you to take, like for instance, voting or spending large amounts of money or using connections to powerful people that you don't have. But if you do have connections to powerful people, that's great. We'll talk a little bit more later about the different kinds of power and how that's going to influence your campaign. But for now, just think about what makes the most sense for you practically, I guess, and then combine this with the answer to what's the most compelling, and then decide how to focus your campaign on a specific slice. By the time you get to the end of your solution, you should have a specific idea in mind of what the community you're acting in needs, and also how to address the problem. And then in the next section, the goal, you turn that into something more specific. So why are these disappearing? Okay. So for the goal, you're thinking about, right, a more specific policy handle. What is the specific way we're going to enact our solution? This can apply more to campaigns when you think about the policy handle, but projects also can integrate policy, and the question can also apply to projects that aren't dealing with policy at all as well, because you're still going to have to say, well, what's a specific thing that my project is going to do? Then, and again, this is more campaign related, you want to think about your target and who has the power to say yes or no, who is the decision maker on this particular piece of policy, on the permissions I need to get this project done, et cetera, et cetera. Your target may change depending on the phase of your campaign. So you may be laying out like a map of different targets as your campaign develops, as your, for instance, to use a bill for an example, goes through different committees and gets to the floor, and then may go to the governor or to the ballot, depending on what you're working on. Example targets for policy can include state legislators, local city council members, or for a project, maybe it's a school that you want to partner with to create a program of students, or average people. Like say you need to recruit someone for litter pickups, then average people are going to be your target. The goal should, this section should lay out your target. So again, who has the power to say yes, and your action. What do you want them to do? Think about in this section, if you were to send them an email asking them to take an action, which you may do later on, what the action is that's specific enough for you to ask them in the email, and that they can give you a definitive yes or no. They should be able to read your action segment and know exactly what's being asked of them and whether or not they can give you a positive answer, or at least think about a positive answer. And then think about your timeline and kind of sketch that out. When do you want your target to do the thing by, and focus on the timeline that's winnable. Again, returning to the word specific and realistic. It's easily possible not to achieve the first goal of your timeline. So be prepared to adjust the timeline as you move on and as you just learn more about your campaign and the problem, right? You may start out working on a bill. You haven't worked on bills before. You don't know the process that it takes for them to go through. And obviously, you can't anticipate every hurdle that's going to come your way. So it's totally fine to adjust the timeline. But still, having a timeline is really essential, especially when you're getting started, because it helps you and also new people to be motivated to have a goalpost, and also gives a sense of urgency to your campaign that will prevent sluggishness to keep you all moving. Still, if the timeline isn't realistic, the stress can limit your campaign and prevent you from doing like mini projects or intermediate goals that you could otherwise do that would have a lot of other benefits, like recruitment or leadership development or something like that, that would just improve your campaign. So don't create a timeline that's limiting. You should end the goal part of your proposal with an end game to your campaign that looks a lot like a SMART goal. So specific, measurable, attainable, or realistic, relevant, and time-based. So kind of hitting all the points that I mentioned before. Basically, you should be able to imagine what either an end to your campaign looks like or a maturity phase of your project looks like. Like, I want my project to look like this at the end, or not necessarily an end, but when your work has been done and you are healthy and you don't want to, or you don't think you can necessarily progress past that point. Just remember to leave yourself space for intermediary goals, and not to sell yourself short by saying, oh, I'm only going to do this, and then I'm going to stop there and my campaign is over. So better to shoot bigger and then set yourself intermediary goals that are more realistic if you're caught between two things. Next, we have the strategy, which is how you're actually going to achieve that goal. So first, think about your theory of change, which is just like a fancy way of saying, how do you think this change is actually going to happen? So what is the target's self-interest? What do you think is going to motivate them to say yes or to say no? What's blocking them from doing the thing? And what can you do to be able to change their opinion? How do we get the target's self-interest to align with our goal, which is kind of the similar thing? And what will lead to a change in self-interest? These all tie pretty closely together, and it's all about the mechanics of knowing how you're actually going to go and speak to your target and have a conversation with them, even if it's, or with multiple people, say if you're doing, how you're going to have the marketing to them to be able to get them to do what you want. You also need to learn the lay of the land. So who is influencing the target now? Where is the power? We talk a lot about power mapping in NGSSC, and we do have a power mapping training if people are interested in that. We can definitely set up that training if you guys are interested. So be sure to message me. It's not going to be one of the first trainings we have, but maybe later on would be very good. And you want to power map at least the target's inner circle, which is essentially, this means having an understanding of what power your target has and who they have power over and who has power over them. So this can be family or friends, their aides, if like their legislator, their colleagues, or the communities around them, or other organizations that they have connections to. With politicians, a good way is to follow sponsorships and money, who is helping them get elected in their communities, because these types of people and these groups especially have a lot of power over them. And understanding how strong that power is versus your powers, maybe just a constituent, for example, is important to understanding leverage that you bring to a situation. Then you also want to think about your opposition. So who might be against your solution? What is their messaging, and where do they fit in this power map you've drawn out? How much power and leverage do they have over your targets? This can be hard at first, especially if your opposition isn't very vocal. A lot of times with Green Amendment, for instance, we have hearings and no one speaks against it, but we also haven't passed despite being in the legislature and doing relatively well and having a lot of co-sponsors for many years. So clearly we have opposition, but we don't quite know who it is. So at this stage, if you don't know, just try imagining what your opposition is going to be like, what arguments they're going to propose, and prepare counter arguments for yourself. And opposition may not always be vocally, we hate this bill, we can't pass this bill, or we hate your plastic pickup project, it's going to do this and that to the community, we can't have this done. It can be people with more mild concerns, and it can be questions that are not necessarily antagonistic. So prepare for those too. And always think about what power or influence does the opposition have how is their kind of power different from yours? So we'll talk more later in the training about the types of power, but think about how you and oftentimes say opposition forces we face, such as businesses or more established political groups, how they have different types of power that may outweigh ours, or how our power may be better in a specific situation than theirs. But again, talk about that a little bit later. Generally, in like environmental organizing, the opposition we face is often businesses or opposing political groups, or even other members of the communities we're in whose interests run counter to environmental protection, or maybe just uneducated on the issue. Opposition is, again, not always antagonistic, but may just not know as much as we do about this specific environmental issue. So be prepared for the opposition to have more influence in terms of money, political connections, and also age, because a lot of times we're working against people who have more experience and who will be taken more seriously simply because they're older. This is the great part about student organizing that I'm sure you all were excited to hear about. Then you take that strategy and you build it into tactics, which are concrete, specific actions that are going to fulfill your strategy and also build organizational power. I mentioned before this idea of intermediary goals that will have additional benefits. All of your tactics need to be aimed at the goal that you set up earlier in the campaign proposal. However, all tactics should also have some other benefits that will build up the organization as a whole and also your specific team. So as you're choosing which tactics are better, if you're not sure where to spend your energy, think about not only these direct goal-related benefits, but also what's going to help NJSSC and your campaign in the long run with other goals like recruiting people, educating people, and developing leadership. So again, specific actions fulfill your strategy and organizational power, and also thinking about efficiency. So how to get the most done with the fewest resources, especially because at NJSSC, resources like money and also time and people often run short. So again, I mentioned efficiency as a main reason that we do campaign planning in the first place. So you want to choose tactics that are efficient with resources, again, especially time and people, because at NJSSC, right, we're all full-time students. That is kind of like, having a full-time job. This is the side thing a lot of us do. And that doesn't make it less important to us, but we do have to act realistically with the fact that we and all of our members have that big responsibility and often other responsibilities on top of that going on alongside NJSSC. Hopefully, all of your tactics should get the most done towards both your team's goals and NJSSC's overall goals. You also need to make sure that your tactics are fitting your overall strategy. For instance, if you want a plastic ban in New Jersey, which we already have, but in the past, if you wanted that, you may think that holding a plastic pickup event is going to help you. However, a plastic pickup event doesn't target legislators. A lobbying day in Trenton talking to legislators, or a newspaper campaign that legislators will read, or a webinar that you invite legislators to is going to be more effective. Even though these things don't necessarily combat plastic waste directly, they do make impact on the legislative issue. So you need to think about what specific segment of a bigger problem that you're tackling to fit into your strategy and do appropriate tactics. And tactics should also be measurable. And these measures need to be meaningful. You can't just set random numbers. So kind of thinking about SMART goals again, our goals should be in that format, and also our tactics should fulfill a lot of the same requirements of a SMART goal. So these measurements are both to motivate you and to keep you accountable. So you need to make sure that they're aimed high, but they're not too high, that they're not realistic. You should be growing your campaign to reach the goals, but not expecting unreasonable growth. But on the other side of that, if your campaign isn't growing, then maybe you should up your goals more to just improve your reach and improve you as a campaign. This is kind of a sweet spot that will take a little bit of time and practice to find. So it's okay to set measurable goals that are too low or too high at first, and to do a little experimentation as you get to know your team and get to know how productive you are and how much you're capable of achieving. Just make sure that you are adjusting over time as you do learn more about your campaign. Essentially, basically what all this means is that tactics should also be like SMART goals, just like the overall goal of the campaign and the specific goals that you're going to be setting each month when we talk about your deliverables and all of that good stuff in your indies. So to talk about some examples of tactics, tactics generally fall under these categories. So we have grassroots, which is probably all of you have heard this word a lot before. We hear this a lot in NJSC because we are essentially a grassroots organization. Basically, what it means, though, is that your theory of change is relating primarily to average people, and you believe average people are your targets and the ones who are going to achieve your goal. So they can be your direct target, or they can be your connection to your target and your means of winning them over. So grassroots tactics usually involve things like phone banking, canvassing, educational events and webinars, again, where your main audience are average people. Grass Tops is the flip side of this. So instead of focusing on general community members, this is focusing on the leaders of the community, primarily policymakers or maybe business leaders in our cases. This involves working with them more personally, trying to get one-on-one communications and meetings. So things like lobbying will fall under Grass Tops. Then you have coalitions or coalition building, which is another one of our trainings that definitely message me again if you are interested in. This is going to involve things like thinking about what other organizations share your goals, especially ones that have different kind of power from yours that can complement you and make up for where NJSC lacks, for instance, money or connections to political figures, that sort of thing. Coalitions are essential to every single campaign. So you need to make sure that as you're starting out, you're planning out what type of coalition of allies you can build who share your goals, but will complement you with different kinds of power. So allies can be schools, they can be political groups, community justice and aid groups, older environmental groups like Sierra Club or League of Conservation Voters, and even business groups. It's actually a great idea to team up with what is usually thought of as like the opposition. So in Green Amendments, we're trying to get more connections and more allies in terms of business and in terms of unions who are not generally allies with environmental causes. Next is media. So these are things like newspapers, social media, videos, blogs, everything that falls under that category. You're going to need some media in your project, no matter what, to help teach people about your actual campaign. What kind of media that is depends on your targets. So if it's legislators, then they're more likely to see an LTE in the local paper, while a grassroots audience will more likely see an Instagram post or a YouTube video. This ties in really closely with visibility, which is both on and offline. Visibility, usually it's media that's bringing you a lot of your visibility. So you want to think about who do you want to see you and for what purpose and where they are going to consume your media. Then tailor your media so that you get visibility with the right audiences in the right way. Usually this includes using social media as well as traditional media, but also flyers, public appearances, or speaking about your campaign. It can be public shout outs with other organizations or holding events. And then finally, there's lobbying, which is really closely tied to Grass Tops. It's mostly self-explanatory. I'm sure we all know what that is, but really it's important to drive home how incredibly effective it is for legislation. You can hold a million events about a piece of legislation and it can never get passed, but a couple meetings with the right legislators can make a huge difference and make sure that you get up for a vote. So a lot of people, they don't do it because it's intimidating and it really is time consuming to build the individual relationship with legislators and get those meetings, but it is really, really important, especially if you're doing a policy campaign, but even certain projects, especially if local politicians who have access to grant money or can give you permission to do certain things can still be really important. But it's still only relevant if you have a specific bill you want to pass or a specific thing that you want from your local government. So make sure you're not lobbying without an end goal in mind. You need to have a specific ask, and you need to know that it's within the powers of the legislator or other official that you're lobbying to be able to do that thing. So always do research on them beforehand. These tactics as a whole are usually used in conjunction with each other, and none of them are exclusionary. Grassroots and Grass Tops are kind of two sides of the same coin. Grass Tops and lobbying are closely involved with each other, and visibility is important to grassroots, et cetera, et cetera. This is one example of a type of strategy chart that can help you decide what type of strategy that you're going to take moving forward. Sorry, especially at the beginning of your campaign, where you are doing your first campaign or your first project and you're not really sure what strategy to use. This is a great way to help you decide how you should be modeling this and what tactics to use. This has basically 4 different approaches. So first, you want to figure out where constituents in your target stands. So if your constituents agree and your target both agree, that means you are the hero. Basically, there's all the will in your community to get this thing done. They just need a person who's willing to dedicate the time to do it, and everyone will love you for it. So you are kind of like this hero. If the constituents agree and the target disagrees, that means you need to activate the community to put pressure on the target. So a lot of times this will mean doing grassroots things to use constituents as a way of pressuring the target, getting the target to change their mind. If the constituents disagree, but the target agrees, then the people you're winning over instead of being the target are the constituents. And you need to provide a way for the target to do what you're asking of them without getting people to disagree. So you're going to try and help the targets either, I guess you could say, cover their actions by explaining what they're doing to the community, doing things like education and helping the target figure out a way to do this that won't upset people or may seem less radical if people are worried about that. And if the target disagrees and constituents disagree, that is the hardest thing. And that is kind of like this hearts and minds strategy. You need to win over people's hearts by kind of appealing to that pathos and getting them to agree with you, and also win over their minds through education of the target and of the community. If that doesn't work, you may have to actually rethink what you're doing because, well, if everyone hates what you're doing, then maybe it's not right for this community. Maybe it's not the best way to move forward. So go back, re-educate yourself and think, is this the best solution? Or is there a better solution to this problem that is going to make more sense for this community that people will agree with? None of these are exclusionary. A lot of times it's in between. Obviously, some constituents will agree and some won't agree. Targets, it can depend on your targets. You may have like a divided town council. But this can definitely help you, and you can use different strategies in conjunction with each other and like present yourself as a hero to one target, as pressure to another, stuff like that. But it's a good type of way organizing when you first get started out. And now finally, types of power, which I've been saying we will get to for half of this presentation. So there are a lot of different sources of power. There's electoral, which is essentially voting power, which most of us, unless we've already turned 18, don't have that. Economic power is related to money, and that can be money in relation to businesses. How much consumer power do you hold? Or money in relation to campaigns. A lot of campaigns depend on organizations and even voters to help fund them. And so you'll find that a lot of legislators, things like unions and other organizations that are donating to their campaign are going to have a lot of power, economic power over them. Then there's moral power, which is you have a specific authority over the issue and you think that people morally are going to feel like they have to agree with you. This is the type of power that NJSSC has the most of. As young people, we often come to adults with the argument, we are young people, we can't make these decisions ourselves in our government, we can't vote, we need you to make the right decision for us to protect our future. That's like the classic example of a moral argument. And really there, that's where you can, okay, hopefully I can finish this before the meeting runs out. If it does run out, then everyone can just rejoin the same Zoom. But moral power is really thinking about where do I specifically have the moral upper ground over someone who in most cases maybe has power over me, especially adults. Then there's legal and regulatory power. So that's the power of legislators, that's the power of state officials and different governmental organizations who are making the laws. And it's also the power of lawyers. Lawyers give you more legal credibility, and so legal power. And then there's disruptive power. Generally, this is another type of power that NJSSC has a lot of. It's the power of rallies, of protests, of strikes, of basically just disrupting the normal way society works. We generally like to use this after we have all other options because it can have a negative effect. It can antagonize your target or antagonize your community. If you're in a hearts and minds situation where you're not going to have a lot of people to come out to your rally and you're just going to make a lot of people mad by blocking traffic, don't go for the disruptive option. But if you're in a pressure situation where you can bring a lot of constituents who agree with you and then show the target there's a lot of pressure for them to do the thing you're asking, then disruptive is maybe a better option. But you need to be a little bit more careful about that one because it can gain you a bad reputation. There's also this idea of strategic power versus tactical power. Strategic is power you already have based on the kind of organization that you are. So for instance, I already said NJSSC has a lot of moral power. Tactical power is the kind of power that you want to gain based on the tactics you use. So grassroots tends to usually gain electoral power by turning people their way to vote on something, or economic power of just the masses. Lobbying is generally gaining to seek some degree of legal power, often by utilizing electoral power. So these types of powers have interplays with each other, right? And there's also hard power versus soft power. So basically legitimate authority versus personal relationships. This is something to keep in mind as you create your power map. It's good to include people with both types of power around your target and understand what type of power each person in that situation has. People may have multiple types of power. For instance, a colleague who is also their friend will have soft power because they, as a fellow legislator, right, if they're both legislators, can, as a friend, pressure them to do something. And also as a colleague, professionally can say, hey, I think you should do this. And especially if they have authority over them in their career, that's a type of hard power. And then there's also this idea of power over versus power with. Power over is taking power away from someone to gain your power versus power with someone is more like coalition building. Ideally, we like to coalition build, even when working with people we think of as opposition, we try and go for that first. But sometimes reducing the power of an opponent may be necessary if they can't be cooperated with, unfortunately. And then finally is the proposal review. After you've done all that stuff, you've thought about power, you've created your proposal, and you have a draft written up. First, you want to do a gut check. So all in all, does this plan make sense to you? Is this a winnable campaign idea? Do you think this is realistic? And do you think you can recruit people to help you with it? And does your group have the capacity to take it on? Last year, we had a big problem at NJSSC where we had too many teams being started and we didn't have enough people to fill those teams who were dedicated enough to really make those teams work. So this year, you may have noticed, if you've been with us multiple years, we're downsizing our number of teams a little bit. And that's because NJSSC as a group only has so much capacity, and you as a group will also only have so much capacity, as you will only have a certain number of members, and those members will only be able to dedicate a certain amount of time to your project. So make sure that your targets and your goals all make sense for the amount of capacity that you have. Then check, after the practical stuff, your values and your criteria. What are your organization's mission and your values? For NJSSC, it's educating people, it's building leadership, and it's building connections between different student groups. You want to make sure that your campaign is working in alignment with those values to further the organization and make it easier for yourself, rather than moving counter them. So it's like the idea of swimming with the stream instead of countering it, so that you can go faster and cover more ground. Yeah, and you can always change your proposal to make it fit better. Basically, the best process is to brainstorm your evaluation criteria. What are the values of this organization? What criteria do I have to meet before you write your proposal, rather than trying to write a proposal and then make sure everything fits and kind of jamming your campaign into values it doesn't actually work with after the fact. Remember, when you go over this and when you write it, that this proposal is mainly for you. It's basically there to make sure that you feel prepared to run your project or your campaign. Campaigns are a big undertaking and they have a lot of moving pieces. We talked about really a lot of things today. I don't have to memorize all of that right now, but the idea of writing out the proposal is to help you organize all of the ideas and the tactics and the values and strategy that we talked about today, to force yourself to reflect on them, to consider all the options you have, maybe more so and in more depth than you haven't considered in your mental planning, to make sure everything works essentially before you actually try and do it and find out, oh, this doesn't fit, or oh, this is not possible. So to talk about an example, I'll go over briefly to see if I can have time for questions before the Zoom runs out, the Green Amendment campaign proposal. So you can see all the same structures are here. We have our problem, which is very general, and this is not like a amazing campaign proposal by any means. It's just a campaign proposal. We talk about some specific issues that are at hand. We bring in current events, COVID-19. We did this during quarantine. We have a short solution, which is basically the Green Amendment text. And then we have a goal that's specific. We didn't fulfill it, obviously, but it's by August 2021, 60% supermajority ballot in November. So you can see it's specific and it has time-based tasks. And then we have a little bit more our specific goal. So this is the goal of everyone working for a Green Amendment in New Jersey. And what we wanted to do was train NJSSC members for this and get students involved in the process really, which is more realistic than us passing this bill all on our own. Then we talk about strategy, who our targets are, why we have these targets, what we want them to do, when we want them to do it, and then with our tactics. So training NGSSC members, getting town or county resolutions passed, and lobbying the legislature. And if you know anything about the Green Amendment team, we've grown a little bit more than that over time. So you can evolve your team as you see what works and what doesn't. We map out some potential partnerships, measurables. We didn't really get to doing the specific one. You may not want to do that in a campaign proposal because you may not know enough. And then a why us, which I didn't really talk that much about. That's an additional section that's really analyzing your power and what type of power you have that makes you specifically good for the specific project or campaign, what power you can leverage to be able to do this. Any general questions?